Hey everyone, welcome to my channel, Books, Girls, and Purrs. My name's Leslie. I did it. I made it to the end of October, and we're here to discuss my October wrap-up. I read a total of 11 books. That's a lot for me to tackle in 1 month. I did the same thing around last year, November, where I read 10 books, and that was exhausting. Alright, so here's my stack. I'm gonna move it on over. Oh my goodness. You know, after I've read this entire stack, I noticed that there's, if not a direct, then an ongoing connection kind of threaded through them all. And that's that, the books in some ways speak to issues of capitalism or colonialism, or maybe those are kind of connected, but I found that like a fascinating thread. I was just thinking about that last night as I was kind of going over my notes. Anyways, so wrap up. I don't know how I'm going to talk about these because I love them so much. I think I'm going to rank them at the end. That's what I'll do. Alright, so I read Chlorine by Jade Song. This is a horror coming of age story, and it's told through a mermaid. A mermaid named Ren looks back at their younger life, and we kind of start from there. So we already know from the beginning that she's a mermaid. This is just about her kind of like realizing who she is and what it took to be fully realized in a way. And so in this book, it's so specific to the experiences of her as a human being, a swimmer, the obsessive, kind of like, I don't know, how do you say it, like her focus is so like tunnel visioned and obsessive, and she just needs to transform into a mermaid, and so that leads to some body horror elements, but the body horror elements weren't necessarily just that. It was actually more about the character experiencing puberty. And I just felt like this is the first writer where I've read body horror ever. And also, I always thought body horror, I think of monsters and all this other elements, so really I didn't know anything. But to read body horror of this person experiencing the first period, or just like certain milestones, really created this like visceral experience that I was really pleasantly shocked and horrified by. So this is definitely one of my favorite books of the year. And I've had so many books that I've loved this year. And to touch upon what I noticed throughout these books, on page 25, I think I'll read you that. And my cats are fighting in the background. Oh my god, please don't. On chapter 3, Ren talks about her father going back to China. And it says, America would never let him accomplish anything in his accented speech, so he went back to China to build a business. He promised to send money to us. What is it called when immigrants reverse? When they wake up from the nightmare masked as a dream. And so there's a duality to the character of Ren being a human, trapped on land in a way, wanting to be fully realized and be the mermaid that they are and go back to the sea. But they're also a Chinese American daughter to immigrant parents, and I felt like that was an important conversation that was going on in this book, with the dynamics of parent to child and also the immigrant experience, because Ren does not want to be here. She does not want to be on land. This is not it. And I felt, well, that's a similar experience for her father, right? That's where they connect. The dream, the American dream, is a lie, and he realizes it, and he still has to support his family. So he went back home to China to do something that he wanted to accomplish here, but he couldn't, because, as the character said, he was just not respected because, you know, he has an accent. And you know, it's unfortunate that that's not something that's an indication of, hey, this person has great knowledge, they know more than one language, you know. Anyways, so I thought that was kind of interesting to point out how there are these conventions of expectation, or what is accepted, and both these characters are rejecting that in a way. Anyways, so yeah, I really like that one. Of course, you're gonna hear me say that throughout. I really like that. Oh my goodness, I just finished Piñata last night, or yeah, I finished it yesterday. So Piñata is about a woman named Carmen, single parent. She works for an architecture firm. She goes to Mexico because they're going, her and her firm are going to, what do you call it, remodel an abbey and change it into a hotel. And so that speaks to a lot of things. But first I'll say that plot-wise, as the workers start to dig into the abbey, some artifacts get uncovered, and there's a debate about what to do with those artifacts. And amongst all this conversation about what to do, her daughter swipes something that she wasn't supposed to, and eventually she goes back to New York with her kids, not feeling good about how things ended abruptly, with her being on the project and then having to leave back to New York. And the horror starts from there. There's like an exorcism that needs to take place. There's a possession, basically. What I really like about this book is not so much the horror elements. There's nothing wrong with them. That just didn't really speak to me. What spoke to me about this book is that the world feels so lived in. I felt comfortable and relaxed into it. So there's like this detailed building of this world, but I didn't necessarily feel that, if that makes any sense. I enjoyed all the characters and the different perspectives that were brought in between the main character, who's Americanized, and therefore her kids are Americanized, and just wanting to reconnect in some ways with her roots. I appreciated the inclusion of the people of Nawa and their language, their lore that's brought in to tell the story, and that's how that's shaped. I think that was like what I appreciated the most. I hybrid listened to this on the audiobook, and I would say that I really enjoyed it. But funnily enough, Jesse from Jesse on YouTube just put out a segment and named the audiobook of Piñata as one of the audiobooks that I did not like. I enjoyed it. I'm up for the debate. I enjoyed the person that read the book because I felt like they're bringing like really like acting and bringing in characters and changing voices in a way that I enjoyed. I don't always like that, but I like the portrayals of the characters in this book. Let me see. Oh yeah, I wanted to stay on task with what we're talking about. So on page 198, it says, Mexico is built on makeshift cemeteries, thousands of mass graves, the headstones of countless dead Young women, girls, native people, innocents, and poor suckers. We're cursed. We live on a massive burial ground. Not only is there no justice for the dead, but no respect for their remains, no homage to their memory, nor rest for their souls. Before I comment on that, I'll read one other page. And this is on page 67. It says, stains on Carmen's improvised office wall had come to life and twisted like messages from a remote past and the recent pain of her people, their sacrifice upon being converted and forced to build that abbey, exploited until death in the name of a god that was venerated, was clearly marked on the walls. And so something else that this author explores is a loss of history, a loss of past, a loss of, not a complete loss, but, you know, like a culture and community, a people's, like all those different elements are slowly being lost. And with the Abbey, although it was terrible that it was built in the first place, then there's also this reconstruction going on of the Abbey as a hotel, and that's just another opportunity for more to be lost, right? And also the atrocities to stay buried in a way. And so I felt like that's also something that this book is speaking about, that the monster, the entity, whatever it is, just doesn't want to be forgotten in a way. So there's a conversation about that. Sorry, my cat's right here. And I feel that links into colonialism and also capitalism, because here we have this character coming in and it's ultimately about making money. Carmen does leave at some point the project not finished, unsatisfied, and she reflects on the fact that, well, if someone else takes over that project, she feels if they're not Mexican American, or, you know, if they're white, that it creates like a different context for what's being done. But I feel like I argue against that, because it's not so much about who is spearheading the project. It's still the systemic issue that's going on, right? It's she can't kind of make nice or gloss over or be the face of something and not like I think it's gonna like make it all okay, you know. I don't know, I have a lot of thoughts about that, but yeah, so I think I liked from this book the history and lore more than the horror elements, but that's nothing against the horror elements. Those work just fine. I just appreciated the book for what it's saying overall, culturally, I guess. And so I really did enjoy Piñata. I absolutely love the cover. I think I did mention that I think the inside of the author's portrait is just like so silly. It just seems like so dramatic. But I talked about that in the book chat, so I'll leave that there. All right, then we have White Horse. White Horse is about a character, Carrie James, and I'll read a little bit from the inside. So on the inside it says, heavy metal, ripped jeans, Stephen King novels, and the occasional beer at the White Horse have defined urban Indian Carrie James' life so far. And so what we learn about Carrie is that when she was 2 years old, her mom disappeared. She always thought her mother abandoned her, until one day her cousin comes along and brings her a bracelet, and her mother's ghost appears to her, as well as a monster. And so now this past that she's turned away from, she can no longer turn away. And so the story goes on from there. I did appreciate the story in its originality and how it talks about identity and the nuances of identity. And there is Mexican, indigenous, and other identities that are discussed in here that I really appreciated the conversations coming up. I think I gravitated towards that. There is a discussion, actually in this book and Piñata, about missing murdered indigenous women, and also, oh my gosh, you know what, let me not, I'm gonna forget, but I definitely feel like what's also explored in here is like abuse, violence. And here's another story where we're really seeing how the effects of colonialism on a community. And on page 81, I'll read from that. And this speaks to missing murdered indigenous women as well as identity. And so on the inside it says, you know, same happens to Mexican women. Those women murdered in factories, though no one thinks of them as Indian because they speak Spanish. He said, his laughter cynical dark. And half the time they don't speak Spanish. They speak some kind of Indian. The effing irony. And then on page, I think it's 231, the character Carrie goes on like a tourist event, surrounded by, I guess it's a tourist event for like a Stephen King novel. That's kind of like the theme. And I guess in one of Stephen King's books that I haven't read, like let's say Pet Sematary or something, I guess he relies on like bringing in the subject of Indian burial grounds. And so that's brought up during the tourism event. And so the character Carrie says, it's all Indian burial grounds, I said, wishing I never said it the minute it came out of my mouth. And then his head turns, what's that, young lady? Dale asked, his expression sweetly inquisitive. She said, never mind. And I think that speaks to what the character's trying to get at, is that it was all someone else's land before it was robbed from indigenous people. And this book, something that I didn't like about this book is that it relies a little bit too much on all these nods to Stephen King's book. I wish the author had been more confident in their originality, and then maybe did minor nods to Stephen King. That would have been great, but just not so much. But I do see and value how when she does that, it also gives her an opportunity to bring up critiques for an author that this author clearly loves as well. For instance, the main character's name is Carrie, so that's automatically going to reference the movie and book Carrie. And then I mentioned Pet Sematary. So, and then there's also a bar called Tommy Knockers. There's just a lot of Stephen King references. I definitely think that if you're a fan of Stephen King, you will enjoy this because of all those mentions and nods too. I did enjoy, how should I say this, the story, like the crime portion of it. I wasn't really into the horror. It didn't really work for me. And I wish this hadn't been marketed as horror. I wish this had been marketed as like crime fiction, possibly thriller. But this doesn't really work for me as horror. And if I hadn't known it was horror, I'd probably like it more. So that's how I felt about this. My cats are like, keep getting under my blankets. All right, then I read all these. I'm talking about them out of order. Night of the Living Rez. Night of the Living Rez is fiction. It's literary fiction. It does have minor elements of horror, but it doesn't encompass the entire book. This is more like genre bending. And it bends further from being 12 short story collections into being a full length novel by the end of the book, because when you read it, you kind of see all these different like these abundance of connections between the characters and the story and what's going on. And what connects them all is that there's a tragedy that the community is trying to just put one foot in front of the other and cope with. This takes place in Maine on a reservation, and although there are horror elements, there are also some really humorous moments that really comes from the dialogue between characters that just had me in absolute stitches. I think that's where like the love comes from in this book, is just how like silly the banter and even the arguments are. There are characters I love. There's characters that made me upset. And this is just another example of the effects of colonialism, and how not just the effects, but also how like it affects everyone. So everyone's ingesting this poison, and how do people hurt each other through these practices? And then also after we read this, you could probably maybe reflect on, even including myself, how could I unlearn some of these behaviors? And I will read you page 215 and 238. And on page 215 it says, "The woods were that dark shadow of dusk, and I followed a jagged rough rock path heading to the back of the house. I passed by a large boulder rolled and a place back when the reservation was a burial ground. Couldn't tell that to anyone though, because people talked pet cemetery, but it was true. This reservation was for the dead." And so here there's another inclusion of Stephen King being mentioned, but also how this person doesn't want where they live to be trivialized and boiled down to a fictional tale written by someone else that's not Indigenous, but also in that same breath accepting like the devastation and tragedy of living on that land and what's happened to their people. And I thought that was really beautifully written. And I think this is also another example of a nod to someone else's work, but that it doesn't like overtake the narrative. And on page 238, which isn't necessarily related to what I'm trying to talk about overall, but I just noticed this, and then I'll have to reference the author. On page 238, "Mom stood, then she must be out. Givey mesos. I'm going to bed." And so when I read besos, that sounds like what I know as beso in like Spanish, but Mexican Spanish, which means to kiss. And I found that interesting that those are like the same word spelled differently, but it has the same meaning. And I bring that up because the author is from Maine, and he's part of the Penobscot Indian Nation, and that's where he grew up. And he mentions that he did use their language here and there sprinkled in, but that he spelled the words phonetically, so not necessarily accurate to the language, but just for access and making sure that people pronounce the words right phonetically. And so I thought that was interesting, because I thought the writing was similar, but now I realize, well, because he spelled phonetically, maybe it's written completely different, but it definitely sounds very similar. And I just thought that was interesting to kind of notice that. But yeah, I love this book. I mentioned my book chat, but there's definitely like a constant tone shift, but it all works. And I'd say just pick it up. I'm trying to think about which book I want to talk next. And Then She Fell by Alicia Elliott. This is another book that definitely my favorite of the month. Might be for the year. I read her memoir. This is the author's debut fiction novel. And, sorry, my cats are getting wild. So I'm trying to talk to you, but they're being crazy. So this takes place, this is about a character named Alice. She's postpartum. Her and her husband and her daughter, Dawn, have just moved to a white suburban area. The character is the only indigenous person within her community. So on the outside, I guess a person could think that she meets this ideal kind of like what someone should want. She has a family. She's in the suburbs. Her husband is has a good job, stable job. He's in academics. But she's struggling with her mental health. She's struggling to connect with her daughter. She's struggling to live up to ideals of what a mother should be, what a wife should be. What do those roles look like? And all the while, this character is also trying to write like a retelling of a creation story for the Haudenosaunee. Yeah, Haudenosaunee creation story. And so she's just grappling with a lot. And that's like in present tense, but the story starts out when the character is very young, and Pocahontas appears to her and tries to warn her about what partner she takes on, right? She's saying, you know, the real life Pocahontas went through a lot, and the person that they married put her through a lot. So she just wants the character to be aware and wary of someone that may become her John. And so then we flash back to present day. And what I felt really stuck out is just a struggle for her mental health, but also like when I had brought up earlier, like the pressures of society, I would say it's outside of her culture. It's a pressure of what this character should be in a non-indigenous area of, I believe, Toronto. So I'd say that there's this pressure of like an individualistic society, I'll say. Like if you're a mother, you do it all yourself, you know. There's just like certain rejections of what would really help the character. And what I would see would help her mental health was like if she had her community around her. There's so much to say about this book, but I'd say just read. What am I saying? I also talk quite a bit about this book in my book chat. And I just wanted to read page 247 and one other one that I can't read, but let's go to 247. So Alice says, "I'm not sure," I say, painfully aware, as academics always make me, that knowledge is a privilege, a currency even, especially knowledge of my own people. They like for me to know they're rich in knowledge that should be mine. And I'll read one other page if I could remember which one it was. All right, so Alice eavesdrops on her dad, and he says, Then folks from the universities think they know everything about our culture, he complained to Ma one night when he thought I wasn't paying attention. That they can suck it all up like a vacuum cleaner, claim they're doing us a favor and preserving it, then sell it back to us when we get desperate. I felt like both those quotes exemplify something else that the author is discussing in here, which is like the nefarious nature of academia on an indigenous community. Capitalism is at play when it's the roots are from colonialism, and how like all these indigenous communities have been ravaged, and then these universities will not accept knowledge from those communities. They will only if they like steal it for themselves and then capitalize off it, right? And make money. And something that really stuck out for me when I was reading this was how her husband will take a class about the character's indigenous culture, come back and report back to her like, oh, well, you say you do this thing, but actually it should be this way, because that's what my teacher told me. And I felt like that's undermining. It's like he thinks he's being helpful, but he's undermining her cultural experiences and basically telling her, no, that's wrong. And there's so much to say about that, but it really made me reflect on, you know, there are some cultures that rely on oral tradition, and what is said orally, language, it changes over time, especially when knowledge is passed down. It's going to be metamorphosizing in some way. So the fact that like academia takes what they consider to be knowledge and put it like in this freeze frame way of capturing it, saying like, it almost feels like they're freezing time and saying your culture could only exist and function in this way, when that's not really how it works. I mean, I don't know if I'm making any sense, but there's just a fluidity to culture that changes all the time, and for someone to come in and say like it could only be this way, just isn't realistic, and that's just to say the least, and it's also really harmful. So I just found that really fascinating. So that's And Then She Fell by Alicia Elliott. And let me see. My cats love to circle into my blanket and nuzzle underneath. Alright, I also read R.A. Tison's Saints of the Household. This is a story that's told through two characters, and it's Max and Jay. They are siblings, and the story is told in a series of vignettes that's also broken up by poetry. And I kind of want to show you an example. Like, for instance, it'll say Jay, which is one of the brothers, and then here's a starting out vignette, and I'll go on like that for a while. But then later on, you'll see that there will be like poetry to tell the narrative. So these are two characters that are in their teen years. This is a YA coming of age story. These are two characters that are trying to survive a home life that's violent. There's domestic violence going on in the home. And so on their way home one day, they stop what they think is an altercation between their friend Nicole and her potential boyfriend, someone that she's seeing. And because they stop that there's like potential negative consequences. The police get involved, their future college careers on the line, and they really have to not only have the weight of what may happen to them because of what they did, because to stop this argument, they did use violence, right? So they have violence going on at home. They use violence as a solution. They aren't even sure now what really happened in that moment, as they have to kind of like decompress what happened. So through that, they also lean into their indigenous Bree roots, just to navigate their way. And something that the author did that I thought was really impactful, especially I think for the younger reader, is at some point one of the characters sees themselves on like a video clip, and it's them of being scared. And at that moment, I think the character realized how serious that moment is, how scary it is, how scared they were. And I think that really speaks to when people are in these situations, like, and how the brain copes with it, right? The brain is set up for your survival. And so maybe in a way, through someone trying to survive, their brain may minimize with the trauma of what's going on in order to cope and survive. But because of that, I feel like that takes a person not out of the situation to realize how bad it is, if that makes any sense. And I thought that was really, really telling. And it's on page 184. I think it's a character Jay. He says, "This is the first time I've ever seen myself, and it was really hard to see that, to see what other people might see. The shaking Nicole had seen in me before this. The countless times I felt this way off camera. I looked scared out of my mind. I didn't even know it was this rough. My stomach turned." And so I just felt like this character had this opportunity to see himself and the fear he feels because he spends so much time coping in the home or outside of the home with everything. And I thought that was like really important. It, in a way, like it validates his feelings, it clarifies his feelings, and also reaffirms that what he's going through is not okay. And I thought that was really beautifully written. So I appreciated it. I love the poetic sentiment the author uses. And once again, we see that there's like systems in place that when these young kids are trying to help, it inadvertently creates harm for them. And so we see how like we're in this system that it is supposed to be built to help people, but it could definitely harm as well. And I felt like that was the connection to colonialism that I saw. And this is another cover, by the way, that's absolutely beautiful. I read a trilogy called Buried in a Good Book by Tamara Barry. I could tell you that I enjoyed the first one. I'd say skip the last two. I'll just say that. The main character, Tess, is a writer. I think she's like a thriller writer. She's a newly single mother. She goes to an area where she inherited property from her grandfather to just reassess and possibly restart her life there. And when she shows up, a murder takes place. And so instead of this being something that scares her, it's something that actually thrills her because she is a crime thriller writer. And so she basically nosies herself into the investigation to try and help solve it. And so there's a lot of dark humor in this first book, Buried in a Good Book, that I really enjoyed. It was just really funny to have a character that is delighted in these gruesome moments and then takes herself out of it and realizes she shouldn't feel delighted at all, you know? I like the character Gertrude. What I didn't like about the author's writing over the entire trilogy is that at times she writes the teen daughter as this like two-dimensional whiny teenager, and I just don't really think that really reflects how people really are. And actually that's like one of my pet peeves. I remember being younger, and sometimes I feel like adults forget what that is. There's just like the stereotypical way people portray teenagers at times that I feel like doesn't give our younger community enough credit, you know. So there is that. I did also listen to the audiobook for the second and third book, and the person that read the audiobook, her voice is a little bit pitchy at times, and so that would kind of annoy me. On top of that, there are times sprinkled throughout where the main character will kind of flippantly bring up her white privilege, and I almost felt like it was not necessary in all three books or any of them, only because it didn't lead anywhere. It didn't lead to any deeper conversations. So I felt like if an author is going to go there, they better be willing to go deep and show some sort of like progression, revelation over time, and that didn't happen. So that was a bit irritating. I'd say that's where the connection comes in, as far as talking about like a system in the world that's set up for privileged people to have, let's say, access the way that she has. And I mean, I don't see her getting arrested or or harmed by authority figures or police for the type of things that she does, because no one else would get away with the things that this character does. So yeah, I'd say read the first one, ditch the rest. Let me see. And that brings us to Garlic and the Vampire and Garlic and the Witch by Bree Paulson. This was such a joy. This is going to be like a household staple. I will be reading this every year in October to my daughter and I. So this is about Garlic. There's these, how do you say it, anamorphic characters. And they help out a witch in their community with the garden. She's getting older. She needs help. And so we have this beautiful community of vegetables that live together and just have a really great time. The first book is Garlic and the Vampire. And so a stranger comes into the community, and the community now knows that it's a vampire, and everyone's scared. And because of the lore behind Garlic and Vampires, the community volunteers Garlic to be the one to confront the vampire. And so although Garlic is a anxious character, they are a warrior, they're definitely a people pleaser. And so with all the fears that they have, they are determined to see this mission through. And there's a lot of funny and sweet moments. This is for kids. This is really like middle, I think lower than, what do you call it, younger than middle grade? It's 8th through 12th grade, right? 8th through 12th. 8th through 12th ages. And so, you know, nothing too risky is going to happen in these. But I would also say that if you're into cozy reads, I think you will also enjoy this as an adult, because there's just low stakes, right? Low to no stakes, and just adventure. I like how the character grows and learns to talk things out and ultimately always lean on community and reach out to each other to figure out how to resolve a problem or fears. And I thought that was really beautiful, and that's something that's tackled in both of them. And yeah, I absolutely loved it. I love the creation of lore, especially in the second book. Like it's got to be really hard to stick the landing of ending a series, and even though this is a duology, the author does a really beautiful job. And in fact, Brie Paulson also has some sort of animated series also about a vampire, and apparently it's really good. I saw an interview with her and she happened to mention it. Let me see. I'd have to say the connection to what I noticed this month is that this is a community that kind of runs on a commune, right? So we're seeing an approach to way of life that works, I think, through communism. I hope I'm saying that correctly. But I also found that fascinating the more I thought about it. And so this is actually breaking away from the system that I'm growing up in and showing that there's another way. And so, yeah, I really loved it. I really, really loved it. I love the vampire. I mean, there's even a character that you love to hate in the Carrot. I love also in Garlic and the Witch, there's more inclusion of magic that was very pleasant. I'll just say that. So that's the books that I read for this month. I cannot do that again because I also noticed that when I do that, I also don't focus in and hone on into like a specific author. And that's really been my goal this year, is to each month focus on one author. And this month I just went crazy. So I didn't get to read 2 books by Leopoldo Gout, who wrote Piñata. I just did not have the time. I wasn't going to make it. But I did watch an interview with him, and I'm going to make sure I include it in the details as soon as I can. I just saw an author talk. He was on someone's podcast, and it was such an incredible interview. I really, really loved it. Going off from that, I did see some interviews with Brie Paulson, but I feel like I didn't have enough material to really like talk about the author in depth this month. But again, I did it to myself because I read all these books and I just didn't have enough time to focus research wise, which is why this year I really wanted to pull back on how much I read to just like make room to do research on authors. So yeah, that didn't really pan out that well. Anyways, if you enjoyed any of these books, let me know what you think below. Let me see if there's anything in the Halloween season, I guess, in October that you really, really enjoyed. I definitely stepped out of my comfort zone this year. I feel like I've enjoyed books that were more focused on whether they're nonfiction or even if they're fiction, as long as they're grounded in talking about history, what's going on in society. I've definitely gravitated towards that the most this year. And I've also just really enjoyed focusing on one author a month because you really get to see like the long arc of themes and progress of an author. And yeah, that's it. I'm just going to keep rambling on. Thank you. Subscribe. If you're a returning subscriber, thank you for watching. I really enjoy our chance to just like connect through literary work. Like, what else? Comment below. I should get this down by now, but I kind of talk all over the place. Alright, I love you all. I'll talk to you later. And take care of yourself.